Throughout history, America has had its fair share of wars, but the absolute bloodiest, the war that shook the very foundations of America, so that the painful memory would be forever immortalized into the minds of Americans forever, the American Civil War. What was the cause of that war? Let's look at history to find out. Hundreds of thousands of deaths. War, bloody, violent, brutal. Conflict. Two sides fighting over the same shared land. Hundreds of innocents killed. America itself being ripped apart. The American Civil War. The Civil War was a war fought between Americans because of slavery, different social and agricultural views, different economic views, justice, and more. The Civil War made it so that the United States wasn't this anymore, but this. There were a lot of causes for the Civil War, but all the major causes all fit into one category: conflict. Major conflicts like the Mexican-American War, Bleeding Kansas, and more. Like the Civil War, all these violent conflicts were all fought over something. The Mexican-American War was fought over ownership of Texas. Bleeding Kansas was fought over slavery being led into Kansas. The Civil War was fought over slavery, different social views, different economies, and more. But four problems that either were conflicts or caused conflicts in particular will not only be remembered forever, but were the reasons Americans went off the deep end. Now for the first conflict, Nat Turner Rebellion. The Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 was a typical slave rebellion, or so they thought, because they always had slave rebellions in the South, and the rebellions didn't usually result in anything serious. They had no idea how wrong they were. 55 to 65 white people were killed, the biggest bloodshed in all of the slave rebellions in the South. Now that may not seem like much, but back then, it was a lot. But it was the aftermath that was a true bloodshed. More than 100 innocent slaves were wrongly accused and executed because of the Nat Turner Rebellion. And now for the second conflict, Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought in the general Civil War time period. Bleeding Kansas was fought over whether Kansas was anti or pro-slavery. Kansas violated an earlier law called the Missouri Compromise. It said that everything above the shown boundary was free and everything below it was slave. Since Kansas violated it, the government decided to let the residents decide. Then fighting started to break out. It wasn't officially established as a full-on war until border ruffians came into Kansas and decided to fix the government's indecision by taking the matter into their own hands. Other states started to interfere. Before that, only small battles raged out. The battle that soon followed was so intense and violent, it was as if Kansas itself was being ripped in half. Kansas ended up on being anti-slavery. The third conflict was the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War was fought between Mexico and America over ownership of Texas. Back then, a lot of where the states would have been today wasn't claimed, inhabited, or populated by the United States of America. Mexico and America fought over ownership of Texas because Texas was part of a large area of land that America hadn't claimed yet. People didn't usually roam far from where they lived because since it was unexplored, they didn't know what they'd find. Land was sometimes unclaimed because either people hadn't explored it yet or people hadn't settled into the unclaimed territory yet. The Americans needed more land because the half of North America was becoming overpopulated and the Americans wanted new soil for crops. Over 236,435 innocent people died in that war that ensued. The Mexicans had between 25 and 40,000 soldiers. 13,000 American soldiers died, and over 16,000 Mexican soldiers were killed also. Another major problem at the time was slavery. Slavery was the oppression of a people for a certain reason. In the Civil War's case, it was because 1. The slaves were coming from Africa. so Americans had never encountered people with that color of skin, so they treated them like aliens. 2. Americans needed slaves to do the work in the South, because the farmers were too lazy to do it themselves. African immigrants were abused, weren't respected, barely fed, were deprived of sleep, and if that wasn't enough, they were expected to stay, not leave, and they couldn't fight for their freedom because they would be punished, even if they slowed down during work. They couldn't report to the authorities because the authorities in the South themselves were corrupt and believed in slavery. The South stated that African Americans, or Negroes as they called them, were nothing but property, not living, breathing, feeling human beings. Because of this injustice, riots started to break out. The slaves were given no pay at all. As a review, the Nat Turner Rebellion was a slave riot led by slave Nat Turner. 55 to 65 white people were killed, the most bloodshed in a single slave rebellion ever. That may not seem like much, but back then it was huge. Bleeding Kansas was started when the government let Kansas residents and surrounding states decide whether Kansas would be anti or pro-slavery. Kansas ended up on being free after the government witnessed the conflict with their own eyes. The Mexican-American War was fought over the land of what would become Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of California because America needed more land. Slavery was oppression over the African Americans. This was huge because slavery led into other conflicts. Citations.